On the morning of August 7, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0 at Rabaul Airfield, preparing to escort bombers on a strike against American forces landing on Guadalcanal. He had flown combat missions over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. He had engaged Dutch fighters, Australian Wirraways, and American P-40 Warhawks. He understood air combat with a clarity that came from surviving hundreds of sorties. He knew his aircraft. He knew his capabilities. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that no Allied fighter could match him in a turning fight. That morning, everything he believed would collide with a new American tactic that would leave him raging with frustration. Diving for the ocean to escape, forced to run for safety from aircraft he should have been able to destroy with ease. This is the story of what Japanese pilots actually thought about American naval fighters during World War II. Not the propaganda version. Not the simplified narrative of superior American technology overwhelming outdated Japanese aircraft. The real story is far more complex, far more human, and reveals a psychological transformation that would reshape the entire Pacific War. Before we dive deeper into this transformation, if you find this kind of detailed historical analysis fascinating, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you never miss these untold stories from World War II. The Japanese pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 represented the most elite aerial fighting in the world. They had been training for years, many with over 700 hours of flight time, honed by combat experience over China. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, was a revelation in fighter design. It could turn inside any Allied fighter. It could outclimb most opponents. Its operational range exceeded 1,000 miles without external tanks, allowing it to escort bombers on missions that Allied planners considered impossible. Saburo Sokai, who would become one of Japan's most famous aces, later recalled his excitement at the prospect of facing American carrier pilots. He had been flying fighters for 6 years and had accumulated more than 3,000 hours in the air. He had shot down 56 enemy planes by August of 1942 and was one of the leading aces of all Japanese naval fighter pilots. When American Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal that August morning, Sokai saw it as an opportunity to test his skills against the best pilots the United States could field. The Japanese believed their success came from superior spirit, superior training, and superior warriors. Flight Petty Officer Sokai had endured brutal basic training where recruits were beaten with rattan sticks for the slightest infractions. Passing out from the blows was common. The training philosophy was deliberate. Make warriors tough as nails, forge them in suffering, create men who would rather die than retreat. Only 25 pilots graduated from Sokai's class of 1,500 applicants. The survivors represented the absolute pinnacle of Japanese military aviation. The American pilots they would face that morning over Guadalcanal had trained under completely different circumstances. Many were recently commissioned ensigns with far fewer flight hours. They flew the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, an aircraft that Japanese pilots initially dismissed as inferior. The Wildcat was slower than the Zero at most altitudes. It could not turn with the Zero. In a traditional dogfight, which Japanese doctrine emphasized above all else, the Wildcat should have been easy prey. What the Japanese did not fully understand yet was that American pilots were not planning to fight a traditional dogfight. On that August morning, as Nakajima's formation approached Guadalcanal, they encountered F-4F Wildcats using a tactic that confounded every principle of air combat the Japanese had mastered. 2 Wildcats would work in pairs, weaving back and forth in a defensive pattern. When Nakajima got on the tail of one Wildcat, ready to fire, that pilot's wingman would immediately turn toward him from the side, forcing Nakajima to break off his attack. When he pursued the second Wildcat, the first would swing around to threaten him from a different angle. For the first time in his combat career, Nakajima found himself unable to complete a kill despite having clear advantages in maneuverability. Every time he thought he had a shot, another American fighter would appear in his peripheral vision, forcing him to evade. The tactic, developed by U.S. Navy aviators John Thatch and Edward O'Hare and later called the Thatch Weave, exploited the Wildcat's strengths while negating the Zero's turning advantage. The Wildcat could absorb more battle damage. It had armor protection for the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that the Zero lacked entirely. Nakajima returned to Rabaul furious. He had been forced to dive and run for safety, something that should have been impossible against the slower, less maneuverable American fighters. Saburo Sokai, flying in the same engagement, noticed immediately that these American pilots were different from the Chinese, Dutch, and Australian opponents he had faced previously. They were organized. They were disciplined. They refused to be drawn into the turning fights where the Zero excelled. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was immediate but subtle. They still believed their aircraft and their skills were superior. But a seed of doubt had been planted. If American pilots could neutralize the Zero's advantages through tactics alone, what would happen when the Americans developed better aircraft? That answer would come 15 months later, in the form of a fighter that would shatter Japanese confidence completely. But first, the Americans had to survive long enough to develop it, and the Japanese pilots had to watch as their carefully cultivated elite force began to erode under the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign. Between August of 1942 and February of 1943, Japanese naval aviation lost hundreds of pilots over the Solomon Islands. Not just any pilots. The cream of the pre-war training system. Men with years of experience, thousands of hours of flight time, combat veterans who understood air warfare at an instinctive level. Lieutenant Commander Junichi Sasai, who claimed 5 victories in a single engagement over Guadalcanal, was shot down and killed by Marine Major Marion Carl on August 7. Sasai had previously accumulated 27 aerial victories. His death represented an irreplaceable loss. The Japanese training system had never been designed to replace such losses quickly. Before the war, pilot training took years. Candidates underwent rigorous screening. Standards were impossibly high. Of the 1,500 young men who applied for Sokai's training class, only 70 were selected, and only 25 graduated. This system produced superb pilots, but it produced very few of them. The Japanese military leadership had planned for a short, decisive war where initial superiority would bring quick victory. They had not planned for sustained attrition. By mid-1943, American pilots began noticing a sharp decline in their opponents' flying skills. Japanese fighters still possessed the same performance characteristics. The Zero could still turn inside a Wildcat. But the pilots flying those Zeros were making mistakes that earlier pilots would never have made. They were failing to maintain formation discipline. They were committing to attacks without adequate escape plans. They were dying in circumstances that experienced pilots would have avoided. The problem was systematic. Japan graduated just 4,000 to 6,000 pilots during the entire war. The United States trained 193,000 pilots, including 35,000 Army fighter pilots. More importantly, the Americans rotated experienced pilots out of combat zones to serve as instructors, constantly improving the quality of training. The Japanese kept their best pilots in combat until they were killed. When those veterans died, their knowledge died with them. By 1944, Japanese pilot training had collapsed under the pressure of war. New pilots graduated with as little as 40 hours of flight time, while their American opponents had at least 525 hours. The average Japanese Navy pilot had just 275 hours of flight time by January of 1945, down from 700 hours at the war's start. Army pilots averaged only 130 hours. Saburo Sokai, who survived the war and later befriended many of his American adversaries, recalled watching this deterioration with horror. In 1943, he witnessed training accidents almost daily as instructors rushed poorly prepared pilots through abbreviated programs. Fire engines and ambulances raced down runways constantly to extract pilots from wrecked aircraft. The decision to prioritize quantity over quality meant that inadequately trained flyers graduated to combat units where they died quickly, often on their first missions. But even as Japanese pilot quality declined, something far more devastating was happening. The Americans were about to introduce fighters that would render the Zero obsolete. Fighters that Japanese pilots would learn to fear with a visceral dread that contradicted everything their training had taught them about warrior spirit and fighting to the death. On September 1, 1943, aircraft from the USS Essex and USS Independence participated in a raid against Marcus Island. Several new American fighters flew in that formation, fighters that Japanese intelligence had not yet fully analyzed. They were Grumman F-6F Hellcats, and they were about to change everything Japanese pilots thought they understood about air combat in the Pacific. The Hellcat had been specifically designed to destroy the Zero. American engineers had captured several intact Zeros early in the war and subjected them to exhaustive testing. They discovered that the Zero achieved its legendary maneuverability by sacrificing armor protection and fuel tank protection. A few bullets in the right places would cause a Zero to explode or burn. The Zero's lightweight construction made it fragile at high speeds. It lost maneuverability above 235 miles per hour, exactly where American fighters operated best. Armed with this knowledge, Grumman designed the Hellcat around a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the same power plant used in the Corsair. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, but its massive engine gave it superior speed at all altitudes. It could outclimb the Zero above 14,000 feet. Most importantly, it could dive away from any Zero at speeds that would tear the Japanese fighter apart. The Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns that could destroy a Zero with a single well-aimed burst. It had armor plating protecting the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb multiple hits without exploding. Japanese pilots first encountered the Hellcat in significant numbers during the raid on Tarawa on November 23 and 24, 1943. American pilots reported destroying 30 Zeros for the loss of just one Hellcat. For rookie American pilots, those results were unexpected and immediately built the Hellcat's reputation. For Japanese pilots, the results were terrifying. Warrant Officer Toshuki Sueda had 9 confirmed victories. He had developed a signature tactic for dealing with F-4F Wildcats. He would enter a climbing loop, knowing the heavier Wildcat would stall and fall away. When the Wildcat fell, Sueda would wing over and destroy it from above. The tactic had worked repeatedly. On his first encounter with an F-6F Hellcat, Sueda assumed he was fighting another Wildcat and executed his climbing loop. The American pilot, Ensign Robert Duncan, followed him into the climb in his new Hellcat. The 2,000 horsepower engine kept Duncan climbing when any Wildcat would have stalled. Sueda reached the top of his loop, confident he had defeated another American, and discovered too late that Duncan was still behind him. Duncan fired a burst that blew Sueda out of the sky. Misidentification had killed one of Japan's better pilots. But the real lesson was more profound. The tactics that had worked for years against Wildcats were suddenly suicidal against Hellcats. Japanese pilots who survived their first encounters with the new American fighter reported that it was faster, climbed better, dove better, and hit harder than anything they had faced. Some Japanese aces initially attributed these reports to pilot error or cowardice. The Zero had been invincible for so long that accepting its obsolescence required a psychological shift many veteran pilots could not make. The captured Hellcat that Japanese intelligence tested at Yokosuka Naval Air Base provided concrete evidence that Japanese pilots now faced a fundamentally superior aircraft. The test report, written by Japanese Army radioman Teru Miyoshi, acknowledged that the Hellcat combined performance and sturdiness to create a top-level fighter. The report specifically noted the Hellcat's sturdy Grumman construction, easy maneuverability, excellent speed and acceleration, heavy armament, and bulletproof facilities. The report's recommendations for Japanese pilots revealed how completely the tactical situation had reversed. It advised that combat at 18,000 to 21,000 feet was risky against the Hellcat. Japanese pilots should try to bring the opponent into low-altitude combat where the Zero retained some advantages. When attacked, the report recommended wrapping against the enemy and attacking from the front, making maximum use of firearms. Showing your tail to a Hellcat was described as risky. This represented a complete inversion of Japanese fighter doctrine. For years, Japanese pilots had been taught that superior maneuverability and warrior spirit would overcome any enemy. Now they were being told to avoid combat at altitude, to fear showing their backs to the enemy, to rely on defensive tactics rather than aggressive pursuit. For pilots trained in the samurai tradition of attack and honor, these instructions felt like admissions of inferiority. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, one of the first American Corsair aces, had discovered similar principles months earlier. Walsh recognized that the F-4U Corsair could not turn with a Zero, but it could outclimb and outdive anything the Japanese flew. The key was never engaging in a turning fight. Use the Corsair's speed to dive on enemy aircraft from above. Make one firing pass with the 650 caliber guns. Then use the Corsair's excellent zoom climb ability to regain altitude before the Japanese could react. Hit and run. Never turn. Never try to follow a zero through a horizontal maneuver. Walsh shot down 21 Japanese aircraft using these tactics, but most American pilots were not Kenneth Walsh. They were young ensigns and lieutenants with minimal combat experience who made mistakes that unforgiving aircraft punished with death. Japanese pilots noticed the improvement in American tactics almost immediately. Pilots who had learned to exploit the early Corsair's weaknesses, particularly its tendency to stall at low altitude, found that those weaknesses had largely disappeared by late 1943. The aircraft that had been easy prey in a turning fight now rolled with unexpected authority thanks to modifications developed by field mechanics and combat pilots. Japanese combat reports from late 1944 and early 1945 noted that American Corsair pilots were flying more aggressively and achieving better results. Some Japanese aviators initially attributed the change to improved American training or tactics. Only gradually did they realize that the aircraft themselves had evolved. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. For 2 years, they had owned the turning fight. Their A6M0 fighters could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew, and they knew it with absolute certainty. That confidence had allowed them to engage aggressively and press attacks that more cautious tactics would have avoided. They could get behind an American fighter and stay there through any maneuver the American attempted. When the Hellcat and improved Corsair suddenly became competitive in maneuvering combat, Japanese pilots lost their psychological edge. Some became hesitant, breaking off attacks they would have pressed in earlier months. Others compensated by taking greater risks, closing to shorter range before firing, pursuing Americans into situations they could not escape. Aggression without superiority meant death. By early 1945, the kill ratio had shifted dramatically. Corsairs were destroying Japanese aircraft at a rate of 11-1. For every Corsair lost to enemy action, 11 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. Hellcats achieved an even more devastating 19-1 kill ratio. American pilots flew over 66,000 combat missions in Hellcats during the war and were credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. No other American fighter achieved a better combat record in the Pacific theater. The most devastating demonstration of American air superiority came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. 480 F-6F Hellcats on 15 American carriers faced off against Japanese carrier aircraft in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese launched wave after wave of attacks against the American fleet. In the first attack, 42 out of 69 aircraft were shot down. A second larger raid of 128 aircraft lost over 100 planes. During that single day, the Japanese carrier force lost 240 aircraft out of 370 that had taken part in operations, and another 30 suffered non-combat damage. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from this catastrophic loss. The combination of superior American aircraft and the inexperience of Japanese pilots, hastily thrown into combat after their experienced predecessors had been lost at Midway or over the Solomon Islands, resulted in one of the most one-sided aerial battles in history. Young Japanese pilots with 40 hours of flight time faced American pilots with 500 hours of training, taught by combat veterans who had rotated home to share their knowledge. The outcome was never in doubt. Soburo Sokai, watching from the sidelines after being wounded and partially blinded in an earlier engagement, understood exactly what was happening. The Japanese training system, designed to produce a small number of elite warriors, had collided with American mass production of competent pilots flying superior aircraft. No amount of warrior spirit could overcome that material disadvantage. Japan was losing the air war not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the system producing those pilots had collapsed under sustained attrition while American production had accelerated. The psychological transformation in Japanese pilot attitudes toward American fighters was complete. Early in the war, pilots like Sokai had felt excitement at the prospect of facing American carrier pilots. They believed their superior training and aircraft would guarantee victory. By mid-1944, that confidence had evaporated. Experienced pilots knew they faced better aircraft flown by increasingly well-trained opponents. They knew their chances of survival decreased with every mission. They knew the Zero was obsolete, that improved Japanese fighters like the Kawanishi N-1K arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to change the outcome. Most devastating of all, they knew their own training system had failed them. New pilots arrived at combat units with inadequate preparation, died quickly, and were replaced by even less prepared pilots. The death spiral was obvious to anyone paying attention. Yet Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on fighting spirit and dedication to the emperor, made it impossible to admit defeat or fundamentally restructure the training system. Better to die gloriously than adapt pragmatically. This cultural rigidity would lead directly to the final phase of Japanese air tactics in the Pacific War, a phase that represented the ultimate admission that conventional air combat could no longer achieve meaningful results against American air superiority. In October of 1944, after crushing defeats had turned the tide of World War II decisively against Japan, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of Japanese naval air forces in the Philippines, gathered his men to propose a new tactic. The Americans had retaken Guadalcanal. They had liberated Guam. They were bombing Okinawa. Allied forces were advancing relentlessly across the Pacific, and Japan's commanders knew it was just a matter of time until American forces reached the home islands. Onishi's proposal was stark and desperate. Organized suicide attack units composed of Zero fighters armed with 250-kilogram bombs, with each plane to crash directly into enemy ships. Use young men who knew little more than how to take off and steer. Transform inadequately trained pilots into guided missiles. Accept that conventional air combat could no longer slow the American advance, and resort to tactics that guaranteed the deaths of Japanese pilots in exchange for damage to American vessels. The kamikaze attacks that followed represented the ultimate evolution of Japanese pilot attitudes toward American fighters. Unable to defeat Hellcats and Corsairs in air-to-air combat, unable to train replacement pilots quickly enough, unable to produce aircraft in sufficient numbers to match American industrial output, Japan resorted to weaponizing the deaths of its pilots. The tactic was brutal, effective within limits, and represented a complete abandonment of everything Japanese naval aviation had represented at the war's beginning. Tokushi Maeda, a Japanese Imperial naval pilot who had guided his bomber to Pearl Harbor and released a torpedo that helped sink the USS West Virginia, was forced to join the Kamikaze Special Attack Force in August of 1945. This was the first instance in which Maeda started to question the decisions made by his military commanders. He had accumulated 3,800 hours of combat flying experience. He could not believe his commanders wanted to waste all that in a single mission. The incident was a turning point for Maeda as he began to recognize the fallibility of Japan's leaders and the recklessness with which they treated the lives of the Japanese people over the course of the war. Maeda's kamikaze flight was scheduled for August 16, 1945, but the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki led Japan to surrender on August 14, just 2 days before he would have died. Maeda survived to become a leading figure in reconciliation efforts between Japan and the United States, developing relationships with American counterparts including sailors from the West Virginia, the ship he had helped sink at Pearl Harbor. Richard Fisk, a Marine bugler aboard the West Virginia, became a close friend after meeting Maeda, visiting each other regularly until Fisk's death in 2004. The kamikaze tactic emerged from desperation but also from a specific assessment of combat effectiveness. During the Battle of the Philippines, approximately 27% of kamikaze attacks resulted in either a hit or a near miss that caused damage to American ships. During the Battle of Okinawa, when most kamikaze pilots were going in with minimal training, the success rate dropped to 13%. Bill Gordon, who has collected data on kamikaze attacks since the early 2000s, notes that 87% of kamikazes were shot down well before reaching any ship, many destroyed by American fighters flying combat air patrol. Soburo Sokai participated in one of the final kamikaze missions of the war, though he survived it. On August 18, 1945, after Japan had already agreed to surrender, Sokai attacked 2 reconnaissance consolidated B-32 Dominators conducting photo reconnaissance and testing Japanese compliance with the ceasefire. Sokai initially misidentified the planes as Boeing B-29 Superfortresses. Both aircraft returned to their base at Yontan Airfield on Okinawa, but the action resulted in the death of Sergeant Anthony Mocchione, the last American combat casualty of the war. Sokai was promoted to sub-lieutenant after the war had ended. He retired from the Navy and became a Buddhist acolyte, vowing never again to kill anything that lived, even a mosquito. Despite Japan's defeat with great loss of life, Sokai serenely accepted that outcome, later stating that had he been ordered to bomb Seattle or Los Angeles to end the war, he would have done it gladly. That was a soldier's job, to follow orders and fight for his country. Sokai's post-war reflections on American fighters revealed a complex mixture of respect, frustration, and pragmatic assessment. During a 1991 symposium hosted by the Champlin Fighter Museum in Arizona, Warbird owner Bill Hayne offered to take Sokai for a ride in his P-51D Mustang. Sokai accepted eagerly. Hayne gave him an excellent flight with low-level passes and aerobatics. Upon landing, when asked what he thought of the Mustang, Sokai replied through his translator that the Mustang was almost as good as the Hellcat. That assessment, decades after the war, revealed Sokai's enduring respect for the F-6F Hellcat as the fighter that had most thoroughly dominated Japanese aviation. In interviews and conversations after the war, Sokai maintained that the Zero Model 21 was the best fighter plane anywhere during its brief period of supremacy. But he acknowledged that by far the most important quality for a good fighter plane was its range. The ability to fly long distances affected everything about how a pilot felt in the cockpit. When you knew you had plenty of fuel, it really allowed you to relax and fight effectively. Those poor German pilots in their Bf-109s, with their limited range, never had that psychological advantage. Sokai's analysis of why Japanese pilots ultimately failed against American fighters focused on systemic problems rather than individual courage or skill. He noted bitterly that promotions in the Japanese Navy were based on what school you graduated from and who you knew, not on merit. Some officer could smash up 20 planes trying to learn how to fly, then not shoot down anything, and he would be promoted faster than successful pilots simply because he came from the right school. Those were the kinds of incompetent people who led Japanese aviation into disaster. The contrast between Japanese and American pilot policies became stark in retrospect. The Americans rotated experienced pilots home to train new generations, constantly improving the quality of instruction. If you're finding this deep dive into Pacific War aviation valuable, please consider liking this video and sharing it with anyone interested in military history. Your support helps us continue bringing these detailed historical accounts to light. The Japanese kept experienced pilots in combat until they died, then replaced them with inadequately trained recruits who also died quickly. The Americans had established replacement air groups from April 1, 1944, to put the final polish on pilots before they joined combat units. The Japanese shortened training programs and sent pilots to combat with minimal preparation. By 1945, American naval aviation had achieved complete air superiority over the Pacific. The statistics were overwhelming. F-6F Hellcats accounted for 5,163 air-to-air victories, representing 75% of all U.S. Navy kills in the Pacific. F-4U Corsairs achieved over 2,000 victories with an 11-to-1 kill ratio. Together, these two fighters destroyed the remains of Japanese naval aviation and established American control of the skies over every major engagement in the final year of the war. Japanese pilots who survived long enough to see this transformation understood exactly what had happened. They had begun the war with superior aircraft, superior training, and combat experience that gave them confidence bordering on invincibility. They had faced American pilots flying obsolete fighters like the F-2A Buffalo and outmatched aircraft like the early F-4F Wildcat. They had achieved kill ratios that seemed to validate their belief in superior warrior spirit and fighting capability. Then the material balance shifted. American industry produced fighters faster than Japan could shoot them down. American training programs produced pilots faster than Japan could kill them. American tactics evolved to exploit the strengths of their aircraft while negating Japanese advantages. Most importantly, American fighters themselves evolved into machines that were simply better than anything Japan could field in meaningful numbers. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero at all altitudes. It could outclimb the Zero above 14,000 feet. It could dive away at speeds the Zero could not match. Its 650 caliber machine guns could destroy a Zero with a single burst, while Zeros often required multiple hits to down a heavily armored Hellcat. The Corsair, once it overcame its carrier landing problems, offered even better performance. Both American fighters could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying, while Zeros exploded or burned from hits that Hellcats and Corsairs shrugged off. Japanese pilots noticed these advantages immediately. Combat reports from mid-1943 onward consistently mentioned that American fighters were becoming more difficult to engage. The reports noted that American pilots were better trained, more disciplined, and flew in coordinated formations that Japanese pilots found difficult to break. The reports acknowledged that American aircraft were faster, climbed better, and could escape from engagements that Japanese pilots could not prevent. What the reports could not adequately convey was the psychological impact of facing an opponent who possessed every material advantage. Japanese pilots had been trained to believe that fighting spirit could overcome material inferiority. That belief had worked when the material gap was small. It failed catastrophically when the gap became enormous. No amount of courage or skill could compensate for flying an obsolete aircraft with 40 hours of training against American pilots with 500 hours of training flying superior fighters. The final verdict on what Japanese pilots thought about American naval fighters emerged clearly from post-war accounts. They respected the Hellcat as a formidable opponent that combined speed, firepower, and ruggedness in a way no Japanese fighter could match. They respected the Corsair once Americans solved its handling problems and deployed it effectively. They acknowledged that American tactics, particularly the thatch weave and hit-and-run attacks, successfully exploited American strengths while avoiding Japanese advantages. Most importantly, they acknowledged that American industrial production and training systems had overwhelmed Japanese capacity to respond. Saburo Sokai, who shot down aircraft in China, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and over Guadalcanal before being wounded, understood that Japan lost the air war not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because the entire system supporting those pilots had collapsed under sustained pressure. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June of 1944 crystallized this reality. 480 Hellcats destroyed over 400 Japanese aircraft in what was effectively a one-sided slaughter. Japanese pilots with minimal training flew obsolete aircraft against radar-directed American fighters flown by well-trained pilots supported by the full industrial might of the United States. The outcome was never in doubt. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from that single day's losses. Eugene Valencia, who became an ace during the truck raid in February of 1944, summed up the American pilot perspective on the Hellcat with remarks that were widely reported in the United States. He said he loved the airplane so much that if it could cook he would marry it. That enthusiastic endorsement reflected the confidence American pilots felt in their aircraft. They knew they were flying fighters that were simply better than what their opponents had. That psychological advantage was as important as any technical specification. Japanese pilots never enjoyed that same confidence after mid-1943. They knew they were flying obsolete aircraft. They knew their training was inadequate. They knew their chances of survival decreased with every mission. Some fought with desperate courage, seeking the honorable death that Japanese military culture glorified. Others fought with grim pragmatism, using whatever tactical advantages remained to them. All of them understood that they faced an opponent who possessed overwhelming material superiority. The kamikaze attacks that began in October of 1944 represented the final admission of this reality. If Japanese pilots could not defeat American fighters in conventional air combat, they could at least guarantee hits by crashing directly into American ships. The tactic required only minimal flying skills. Young men who knew little more than how to take off and steer could be transformed into guided weapons. The deaths of inadequately trained pilots, who would likely die quickly anyway in conventional combat, could be weaponized to achieve damage that surviving pilots might not inflict. From the Japanese perspective, kamikaze attacks made brutal sense. They achieved better hit rates than conventional bombing against heavily defended American fleets. They required minimal fuel and training. They exploited the one resource Japan still possessed in adequate supply: young men willing to die for their country. From the American perspective, The kamikaze represented fanaticism and madness. From the Japanese perspective, it represented the only remaining tactic that could slow the American advance. Tokishi Maeda, who narrowly avoided becoming a kamikaze pilot, later reflected that war was between countries, not between individuals. When the war ended, it was natural to reconcile and become friends. His post-war relationships with American sailors from the ships he had attacked demonstrated that former enemies could find common ground once the fighting stopped. Richard Fisk, the Marine bugler who became Maeda's friend, shared that perspective. Both men had done their duty during the war. Both men had followed orders and fought for their countries. Neither held personal animosity toward the other. Saburo Sokai expressed similar views in his post-war life. He met with American pilots who had fought against Japanese aircraft, attended symposiums and air shows, and developed friendships with men who had been trying to kill him decades earlier. When asked about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Sokai stated that he thought the pilot who dropped the bomb was a great hero for the United States. Flying out there with just 2 B-29s and no fighter escort took tremendous courage. At the time, nobody knew about the atomic bomb. There was no international treaty against its use. War was war. The Japanese pilots who survived the war to reflect on their experiences shared certain common perspectives. They acknowledged that American fighters, particularly the Hellcat and Corsair, were superior aircraft that rendered the Zero obsolete. They acknowledged that American training programs produced better prepared pilots in larger numbers. They acknowledged that American tactics effectively exploited these advantages. They acknowledged that American industrial production overwhelmed Japanese capacity to respond. What they did not acknowledge was that Japanese pilots were inferior warriors. The issue was never individual courage or skill. The issue was systemic. The Japanese training system, designed to produce a small number of elite pilots, could not adapt to sustained attrition. The Japanese aircraft industry, constrained by limited resources and strategic bombing, could not produce advanced fighters in sufficient numbers. The Japanese military leadership, committed to outdated doctrines and unable to admit failure, could not fundamentally restructure their approach to air warfare. By early 1945, these systemic failures had resulted in complete American air superiority over the Pacific. Japanese pilots who had begun the war with confidence and superior equipment ended the war flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training against an opponent who possessed every advantage. Some adapted by becoming kamikazes, seeking one final moment of effectiveness before inevitable death. Others simply endured, flying mission after mission until they were killed or the war ended. The transformation in Japanese pilot attitudes toward American fighters was complete and devastating. What had begun as confidence in superior aircraft and training had evolved through frustration with effective American tactics, recognition of American material advantages, acknowledgement of systemic Japanese failures, and finally desperate resort to suicide attacks as the only remaining option. The psychological journey from invincibility to defeat took less than 4 years but reshaped Japanese naval aviation completely. Saburo Sokai, who lived until the year 2000, embodied this transformation in his post-war life. He had been one of Japan's greatest aces, with claims ranging from 28 officially credited victories to much higher numbers in less rigorous accounts. He had fought in China, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and over Guadalcanal. He had been wounded so badly that he was partially blinded and barely survived the 640-mile flight back to Rabaul. He had witnessed the rise and fall of Japanese naval aviation from inside the cockpit of a Zero. In his memoir Samurai, published in 1957, Sokai provided detailed accounts of air combat from the Japanese perspective. He described the excitement of early victories, the growing concern as American tactics improved, the frustration of facing increasingly superior American aircraft, and the horror of watching inadequately trained replacement pilots die in accidents and combat. His book became an instant classic because it provided honest assessment of both Japanese capabilities and failures. American pilots who read Sokai's book found common ground with his descriptions of combat. One P-51 Mustang ace approached Sokai at a symposium and told him through a translator that he had read the book twice. The feelings Sokai described were the same feelings the American pilot had experienced in combat. Both men, despite fighting for opposite sides, shared the understanding of what air combat actually felt like. The fear, the adrenaline, the split-second decisions, the relief at surviving, the loss of friends who did not survive. Those experiences transcended nationality and politics. That shared understanding between former enemies represented perhaps the most important lesson about what Japanese pilots really thought about American fighters. They thought about them the way any pilots would think about the aircraft trying to kill them. They respected capable opponents. They adapted their tactics when possible. They fought with courage even when facing overwhelming disadvantages. And when the war ended, they acknowledged that the better equipped, better trained, better supported side had won. The statistics tell part of the story. American naval fighters shot down over 7,000 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 500 to air-to-air combat. The kill ratios were devastating. 11-1 for Corsairs. 19-1 for Hellcats. Those numbers represent not just technical superiority but systematic superiority across every aspect of air warfare, from pilot training to aircraft design to maintenance support to tactical doctrine. But statistics alone do not capture the human experience of Japanese pilots who watched their air force destroyed. They do not capture the psychological transformation from confidence to desperation. They do not capture the moment when pilots like Nakajima realized that tactics they had relied on for years no longer worked. They do not capture Sokai's horror at watching inadequately trained pilots die in training accidents. They do not capture Maeda's realization that his commanders were willing to waste 3,800 hours of combat experience in a single suicide mission. What Japanese pilots really thought about American naval fighters evolved throughout the war, from dismissive confidence through grudging respect to bitter acknowledgement of complete inferiority. By war's end, Japanese pilots knew exactly what they faced. They faced aircraft they could not match, pilots they could not consistently defeat, an industrial system they could not overcome, and a tactical approach they could not counter. They faced the reality that Japan had lost the air war, and with it, any chance of preventing American victory. The legacy of this transformation shaped post-war relationships between Japan and the United States. Pilots like Saburo Sokai and Tokushi Maeda became advocates for reconciliation, using their wartime experiences to promote understanding between former enemies. They attended air shows, met with American veterans, shared their stories, and demonstrated that men who had tried to kill each other could become friends once the fighting stopped. American pilots welcomed these reconciliation efforts. Men who had fought against Japanese aces respected the courage and skill their opponents had displayed, even while acknowledging their own superior equipment and support. The mutual respect between former enemies honored the dead on both sides while moving toward a future where Americans and Japanese were allies rather than adversaries. What Japanese pilots really thought about American naval fighters was complex, evolved over time, and reflected both the technical realities of air combat and the human realities of soldiers doing their duty. They began the war believing they were superior. They ended the war knowing they had been overwhelmed. In between, they fought with courage, adapted as best they could to changing circumstances, and died in staggering numbers defending a cause that was already lost. The Hellcat and Corsair did not just defeat the Zero technically. They shattered Japanese confidence psychologically, demonstrated American industrial supremacy materially, and established air superiority that made Japanese defeat inevitable. That was what Japanese pilots really thought about American naval fighters by war's end. They thought about them as instruments of their own destruction, unstoppable machines flown by capable pilots supported by unlimited resources. They thought about them with the bitter respect that comes from facing a superior opponent and losing everything in the process. And when the war finally ended, some of them, like Sokai and Maeda, transformed that bitter experience into something more constructive. They became bridges between former enemies, using their stories to promote understanding and reconciliation. They demonstrated that even the most brutal conflicts could eventually lead to peace, and that former enemies could become friends. That transformation, from warrior to peacemaker, represented perhaps the most hopeful lesson to emerge from the Pacific War's aerial combat. Thanks for watching this deep exploration into what Japanese pilots really thought about American naval fighters during World War II. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other detailed historical documentaries, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from history's greatest conflicts.